Last week we talked about leaving, when you move, you can leave old habits behind and carry new habits with you in the future. This week, Thursday morning, I wanted to take us outside, but it's raining this morning, and so we're in an area of the church called the intersection. And you remember when you were little and your mom would take you up to an intersection and she would tell you, look both ways, which is very appropriate. You look both ways and then you move forward. Well, that's great in the physical realm, but in the spiritual realm, God calls us to look both ways as well. But as we look both ways, what he does is he calls us to look to the future as well as to the past. This Sunday, we're going to be looking at Ezra chapter 3, which is a classic story of where the temple of God is being rebuilt. And as the crowd comes to see the construction work and what's going on, the older generation grieves and weeps because this new temple doesn't look near like the old one. And what they're doing is they're comparing. Whereas the younger generation looks at this new temple and they've got nothing to compare it to, and so they're rejoicing. They're thinking, great, we've got a place to worship. God always calls us to the intersection of life to look forward at the same time to look back. You know, you think about when God sets up an atmosphere to worship. In my mind, I think of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, where Paul writes about setting the groundwork for how we approach the Lord's table. And when we take the Lord's table, we're worshiping God. But interesting, he calls us to look forward with great anticipation to the hope that we have in him. But at the same time, he calls us to look back at this particular situation in 1 Corinthians 11, look back at what Christ has done for us on the cross. And so in the act of worship, we're always looking back in remembrance of what God has done before us. Great is his faithfulness. But then at the same time, he calls us to look forward with great anticipation for the hope we have in eternity. You know, the interesting thing is that the older we get, as we approach those intersections, we have a tendency to look back and to stay stuck in the past. Well, at the same time, the younger generation always seems to be preoccupied with the future with a disregard for the past. We have an enemy who's real, and the enemy is always trying to drive wedges and those wedges he drives are based upon differences. And so when you think of black, white, foreign, domestic, well, in this particular situation in Ezra chapter 3, the enemy's trying to cause a wedge between young and old. And it's a story that repeats itself throughout history, that there's always an intersection in life where the younger generation is looking forward, the older generation is looking back, and the evil one tries to drive a wedge between the older generation and the newer generation. God has called us to be aware of that so that we bridge that gap. So the younger generation needs to be mindful and reverent of the past. It's natural for them to look in the future, but they need to stop and take a hard look and be reverent of what God has done in the past and how God has built on the shoulders of those who have run before us and sacrificed a great deal for our well-being. And in the same way, the older generation, we need to be more mindful of looking ahead in the future and the hope that God has for us. It's not a one or the other. It's a both and. And so join us this Sunday as we look at Ezra chapter 3 and the great story of really that's repeated throughout history, this division between old and young. It's a message that every generation in history needs to hear. So I look forward to seeing you this Sunday as we climb into Ezra chapter 3. Have a great next couple of days. We'll see you in a couple of days.